Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here, friends, and happy spring. It must be spring because I'm now wearing shoes. And also, we're talking about sowing beans. I'm so delighted tonight to dive into beans and share a number of other seeds that I highly recommend you resist transplanting. We'll talk about all that so soon. But first and foremost, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Do share your name, where you're finding yourself these days, that geographic location. If you have a favorite bean you are so excited to share, please let us know. And I cannot wait to see. It's such a joy to see where you all are calling in from. And before we begin as well, I would just love to say thank you to so many people, so many plants. Thank you first and foremost and always to our interpreters tonight. Miriam, we cannot thank you enough. Kira, thank you as well. And thank you for bringing your joy and your language justice to us all. I'd also love to thank Matthew, my beloved partner. He is in the chat. So anytime you have a question, from a little clarifying question to a huge existential question, that's what he and I talk about all day long. And he's delighted to accompany us all in the chat tonight. So thank you all for not being shy in that department as well. And now I would love to just also thank our Fruition crew. Before we dive any further, any faster, there are 12 of us full time here at Fruition Seeds, and I would not be here standing, smiling, well, sitting, smiling amid blossoming turnips were it not for each and every one of them and the incredible community that is our wider community here in the Naples Valley and the wider community that is across continents, which you are a part. Whether you are here tonight for the first or 30th time, whether you are just over the hill or across an ocean, thank you for being part of our families, friends. And huge thanks to the ancestors, both plant and human, who for 8,000 plus years have been co-adapting together in this bean department. And thank you to all the future generations who might survive the adversity of our times and yet share abundance. We are here giving thanks for that
Can't
possibility
see you, girl.
So I am delighted also to share to begin with a song, story, poem, as we always do. And this morning, this evening, today, we have a song. This is a song, and I always love to give credit, and I just don't know who to give credit for this song for. It was on a cassette tape of children's songs when I was a tiny child, and perhaps my mother, perhaps my sister will remember. I must remember to ask them. But in the meantime, here's a song that I love to sing, and it's highly relevant whether or not you have cookies in your life at this moment. So here it goes. I'm a little cookie, yes I am. I was baked by the cookie man. And on my way from the cookie pan, a little piece broke off of me. A little piece broke off of me. A little piece broke off of me. But I can taste just as good as a regular cookie can. So I love this song for a lot of reasons. I would love to just start us off tonight reminding us that the cookie is going to crumble and we're going to make mistakes. And I would just encourage us all to remember and remind ourselves, remind each other that these are learning experiences. They are not mistakes. There's no right and there's no wrong. And we're all here learning, growing, climbing this mountain together. So thank you for all of the songs and children and the children's songs that we sing to each other. So without further ado, let's talk about history, and then we'll talk about the types of beans. We'll talk about kind of garden planning, what to keep in mind. We'll talk about how to sow beans. We'll talk about how to thin them and cultivate. We'll talk about the primary diseases and insects that you will find, especially here in the Northeast. And then we will talk a little bit about harvesting, and we'll talk about the common mistakes that people make in together. So, first and foremost, let's talk about history. So, beans are one of the oldest, most anciently cultivated crops that humans have been domesticating. I rather think they've been domesticating us. But for 8,000 plus years, humans have been domesticating beans. And let's talk about first the word bean. It's a German word. Beans, as we think of them, green beans, certainly, and many dry beans, Phaseolus vulgaris, they're indigenous to what we now call Central America. So, how did this German word come into play? Germans have been using the word bean for over 1,000 years to describe things like fava beans and chickpeas, which are potted legumes, also totally different genus species. Totally, except for the family, unrelated to what we think of as green beans. This bean word was also used to describe vanilla beans and castor beans and all manner of other vaguely potted things. So, in fact, bean is an incredibly unspecific word, generally referring to plants that vaguely have pods. So that's kind of a fun backstory on just the word bean and what we classically think of as beans. Think green beans, think dry beans. They are this wonderful Phaseolus vulgaris genus species, indigenous to Central America, their center of origin being what we now call Mexico, where you will still find vining wild ancestors climbing the trees. And beans spread very quickly. They spread up into what we now call North America, down into what we now call South America. They spread far and wide and so fast, quickly adapting to all kinds of elevations, all kinds of ecologies. There are 40,000 vaguely described varieties of beans as we would know them as Beta vulgaris, and in fact, Phaseolus, but four other species of Phaseolus are so many different kinds of beans. Yes, 40,000. So, of course, a very, very, very tiny fraction of them are commercially available. And thank goodness, industrial agriculture has to leave something for the rest of us. And hopefully, there will be something for the rest of us, for any of us that may survive this time. So, yes, those are a tiny, so of course, all of these all of these beings on Turtle Island, colonization violently swept them to every corner of the planet, with very delicious as well as dire consequences, which we are living in this moment as we speak. So there's so much more to share in the history of beans, and I would just love to ask these questions of you and of me and of us all that I'll be asking for the rest of my life. What are these stories of these beans that we're planting this year? And what are the deeper stories of these beans we're planting this year? No, I grew up planting a bean called Mayflower. It was just a few years ago that I realized there was absolutely, it did not come over on the Mayflower to find itself in North America. It was stolen from Turtle Island, taken across the ocean to then come back on the Mayflower. So, yes, what are the deeper stories of these stories that we share? I'll be learning how to unlearn and relearn and joyfully tell these stories more deeply and fully my whole life. So, an invitation to join me and us all on the journey, friends. So, here now let's talk about types of beans. There are so many different types of beans. There are, of course, pole beans and bush beans, and pole beans need to, have some trellising to climb up. Bush beans do not. Fun fact, those lovely pole beans, that's the way that beans Phaseolus vulgaris have been existing in the world for millennia. Bush beans are literally just in the last century, a very modern development. So pole beans, think of it this way too. Pole beans, bush beans, you'll have the same amount of abundance that you'll harvest. The difference is this: a pole bean, it's going to be gradual throughout the season. A bush bean concentrates all of that abundance within a few week period. So there's pros and cons to everything, including both of those approaches. We'll talk more about that in planning, our planning session. And then there's the color of beans, right? There's green, of course, but there's purple and there's yellow. There's even red snap beans. And then as they begin to turn into their dry beans, those marvelous little dry beans, such miracles, are in virtually every color of the rainbow. And they might be solid, they might be speckled, they might be striped, they might be marbled. Some of them maintain those colors when cooked, some just become kind of a gray mess when cooked. And so explore that diversity, so much flavor within those. And then now let's talk shape and flavor, because as far as snap beans go, there are cylindrical beans that you classically see in a grocery store. There are also Italian flat beans or Romano style beans. I tend to find those are more succulent and also more sweet and nutty. I love Romano beans. And yeah, there are also runner beans, which are entirely a different species compared to a cylindrical bean. Runner beans can be delicious, like our Scarlet Emperor. Totally delicious. One of my favorite beans of all time for fresh snap bean eating. Chocolate runner beans, also one of my favorite beans, to dry beans to simply look at, but their snap stage is very fibrous. So yes, enjoy tasting all of these diversities. And of course there's snap shell and dry beans. Snaps beans are ones that snap in their green stage and that aren't too fibrous. We can simply eat them. What many of us think of as green beans are simply beans in their snap stage. Shelling beans were totally a thing for a long time. They've kind of fallen out of vogue, if you will, but they're delicious. They're so creamy. They don't take nearly as long to cook as dry beans. And you harvest them just before those pods turn from green to gold. And depending on the variety, they might be brilliant red, they might be any number of colors, but they'll pop open. And those beans are mostly dry, like 3/4 of the way dry, but they're incredibly exquisite. And then there are dry beans, which you harvest from green pods, and they're like small stones. They're rock solid. And those are, of course, seeds for next year, which I hope that you save and share with friends. And they're also delicious to feed us in all manner of ways, in all manner of seasons. So, yes, all different kinds of beans. There are also edamame, which is soybeans, which you can eat as soybeans classically dry, but edamame is the green, kind of the shelling phase, except the pods are entirely fibrous. So you just slip those lovely beans out. And then beyond those beans, there are so many more. There are lima beans, there are tepary beans, there are yard-long beans that are also called asparagus beans. This is actually asparagus, but asparagus beans are really lovely as well. And then, oh my gosh, there are hyacinth beans. There are so many different kinds of beans. So now let's talk about planting beans in our gardens. So here are a few things to keep in mind. You want to direct sow them. Resist transplanting. Resist transplanting. Resist transplanting beans. We'll talk about that in just a moment. You also want full light. You want them after frost to be sown. In cold, cool soils, they will simply rot rather than sprout. And then if you're planting pole beans, plan on trellising them. If you're planting bush beans, plan on enjoying them for just a few weeks. Plan on, if you want to harvest them over a wider period of time, succession sowing them. We'll talk more about succession sowing soon. Planning for every 3 weeks give or take, and with that final succession no later than 3 months before your first frost in fall. Other things to keep in mind, you can totally grow beans in containers. I highly recommend bush beans rather than pole beans in containers, and 10 gallons minimum, 15 gallons or larger, better. Don't skimp on fertility. We'll talk about beans in containers really soon. And also a few invitations. Plan, as you're planning to grow beans, plan on tasting a flower this year. They're really delicious. And the hard part is, if you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't eat your flower and expect the bean to grow, but there's going to be a lot of flowers. There's going to be a lot of beans. Plan on tasting at least one bean flower, and then you'll know what they taste like, and they're heavenly. Also plan on saving a few seeds. Beans are incredibly easy to save, and certainly in our in that bean growing guide that you'll see in the follow-up email to this, and also if you're watching the replay, you'll see the link below where you can just opt in, and I'll send that straight to your email. You'll find a whole seed saving section on beans. So plan on saving a few beans just because they're easy and so fun. And then when you save a few, you generally save more than you need. So plan on sharing some with your friends. It brings us so much joy. And I look so much forward to you enjoying that same joy as well. So now before we dive into sowing beans and any more about beans specifically, I want to just go through the laundry list of seeds to generally resist transplanting, as well as a few tips if you feel you must transplant them for how to do it well. So here is the laundry list of seeds to resist transplanting. Beans, of course, is the topic of the night, but also peas, and also dill and cilantro. Oh, they bolt so quickly when they're transplanted, so just direct sow them. And of course, carrots, radishes. If you have root vegetables, definitely direct sow them. Beets can be an exception. It's better to direct sow them, but you can transplant them. We'll talk about that soon. And also squash, winter squash, summer squash, cucumbers, melons, better direct sown, but I'm about to show you the technique that we actually use to do quite a bit of transplanting and why. And also, so there you have the long, lovely laundry list of seeds. Most sincerely, they really don't care. Oh, and corn. They really don't care to have their roots disturbed in any way. So resist transplanting them when you can. If you want to transplant them, here are a few keys, and here is why we transplant some of them. We transplant them because we're planting them into mulch. So that way we can mulch, we can reduce our weeding and have that water retention at the same time. And here's the thing, we can just pull back that mulch and tuck in that transplant. But you want to make sure that you are actively putting them in a soil block. Take a look at this baby corn that we're about to plant out in a soil block to be transplanting it at. Its root, look at that, has already, it's so small, already emerged that much. Corn, who knew? As much as they have a very fibrous root system, they also have a deep tap root, and it really doesn't love to be constrained in any way. So now is the perfect time to be transplanting this corn. Any longer, you're asking for trouble. Take a look, and mini blockers, don't be tempted. Mini blockers are amazing for starting seeds that take their time germinating, that need extra heat to germinate, like tomatoes and peppers and perennial flowers and herbs. Way too small, way too much little soil for something that doesn't want to have its roots disturbed. So only do any transplanting with these large blocks. Also, you can use cow pots or peat pots. Cow manure is much more renewable than peat. And I mean that it is more renewable than peat, but there's not much that's truly renewable or regenerative about dairy. I digress. But for the moment we find ourselves in, cow pots are a much better option. With these, I don't love them because you still have to transplant, you still have to plant them and ensure that none of the edges of this peat pot, cow pot are above the soil. And simultaneously, you can't be burying any of the stem of any of these plants. So it's a delicate matter, which is why I always prefer soil blocks over cell over cow pots. And take a look at these two. We're about to plant these out. And literally, this is the more ideal stage of this summer squash compared to even that first burgeoning true leaf. That is this is the latest possible stage. Any more than this, they're going to be stressed. So yes, anytime so literally plant them out in large soil, plant your seeds into large soil blocks, thin them down to one seedling. I recommend just planting one seed in your soil block. And then as soon as those cotyledons emerge, yes, totally plant it out then. If you're planting beets, you can not thin them. Having no more than 4 is ideal. But then with that 4, you can let those will gently just push against each other and grow out. You can plant those in a grid rather than a row. But when it comes to corn, when it comes to squash, when it comes to melons and cucumbers, you want just one plant in your soil block. So yes, there you have it, friends. Some tips. You can totally transplant these crops. Just disturb those roots as little as possible. And I highly recommend that when it comes to beans and peas and dill and cilantro and carrots, you especially resist transplanting. Okay, so let's continue on with sowing beans. So you want to sow them direct in the ground. You want to give them full day sun. You want to plant them after frost, not too much before. We'll talk about that soon. Ideal pH 6.0 to 6.8. If you haven't already tested your soil, do it and check out our beautiful Soil Testing Made Simple blog. Nothing is simple, but it's not that hard, and it will be so much of a revelation once you actually test your soil and keep making those little, not so subtle adjustments that you would never otherwise know how to make. So now, days to germination. In 6 to 8 days, your beans will germinate if the soil is like 75, 80 degrees. Less than 60 degrees, your beans are so prone to rotting rather than sprouting. So it's true, you can go out with a just thermometer from your medicine cabinet and your soil will say. And that is a very handy way. Right about final frost is about the perfect time to be sowing your beans as well. So for us here in Zone 5, that's about Memorial Day. And here's a fun little fact. If your beans have a dark seed coat, imagine a black bean. A black bean has a much darker seed coat, and that, for whatever reason, confers a little bit more resilience, being able to sprout more readily in slightly cooler soil compared to a lighter seed coat color. So if you have a darker bean seed coat, you can get away with a week, maybe a little bit before your final frost, and be a little more confident that it's not going to just rot in the soil. But there's also, I mean, what is the rush? Unless you're a market farmer that's going to get top dollar with those first beans to market, why rush? So push the envelope a little bit, however much you like. Now you know dark seed coat beans will sprout a little more tenaciously in cool soil. And we always just hold off a little bit longer, just so they just sprout out of the ground that much faster and it's that much less weeding. So, other things to keep in mind, only you want to sow them 1 inch deep. And honestly, beans are really flexible. I just want to shout out my father here for a moment. I grew up in my father's garden and I will always be so grateful. And beans and peas were some of the first seeds that he let me sow all on my own. And he let me sow those for a few reasons. They're nice and big so that my tiny little hands that aren't as dexterous as they might be later in life. Although who's saying what? But he knew that my hands could pick up more easily those bean seeds compared to a tiny little, carrot seed and plant it in the ground. He also knew that it might make it 3/4 of an inch in the ground. It might make it 1.25 inches in the ground. Who knows? But those beans were going to be just fine. So my imprecise childlike hands, they were wonderful for planting peas and beans. So if you're planting with children in your life, please encourage them in all the ways to be engaged, and children of all ages. It's just so much easier to plant beans compared to so many other things. So, yes, but nonetheless, regardless of their imprecision and wide tolerance of lots of different sowing depths, that 1 inch deep is such a good rule of thumb. And within the row, you want to be planting them 3, 4 inches away from each other. And then as they're emerging, you want to be thinning them to 6 inches between plants. So young, early and often is a good rule of thumb for thinning anything. In the bean department, if you can be thinning them as the cotyledons are emerging, fabulous. If that first true leaf is emerging, it's final call. Again, they don't like having their roots disturbed, and especially if they're that close. Roots always emerge from seeds before their shoots. So if they're above the ground, they're going to be much more extravagantly below the ground. So the earlier you can be thinning, the less disturbance you might be encouraging their friends to be experiencing. So, yes, with pole beans, if you might not be planting those in a straight row, in which case maybe you're growing on cattle panels going up over an arbor. Maybe you have this kind of teepee kind of situation. Maybe you are growing them up corn or sunflowers. In those cases, you want to have 3 seeds around each sunflower stalk, around each corn stalk, around each pole going up. So that's that general rule. And having 6 inches in between those seeds as well as the central stalk is crucial. And if you are sowing around corn or sunflowers, just be sure that you give that sunflower, that corn stalk, 2, maybe even 3 weeks, but at least 2 weeks a head start, because those beans are going to go nuts and they will outcompete and clamber all over that corn and smother it unless that corn and sunflower gets a chance to rise up first. So, yes, hot tips for growing um, beans up a trellis that is alive. And if you're growing in a row, you want to have at least 18 inches between those rows so there's plenty of space for that foliage to grow and not be overlapping too dramatically. As we'll talk about soon, there's a lot of diseases to contend with here in the Northeast. So the more you can have airflow and the more you can reduce humidity, you will be just setting yourself up for that much more success. So now let's talk a little more about trellising. So it's good to trellis right away. If you're trellising with something like metal stakes or something like wooden stakes, those are marvelous. Make sure they're at least 5 feet tall and they will keep growing and growing and growing. But I find more than 6 feet, it gets really challenging to actually trellis them that far. And they'll grow and they'll flop over and then they'll keep growing. But 5 foot minimum is a really good baseline. And again, because those beans don't love to have their roots disturbed, the earlier, if you can actually establish the fencing and then plant your beans, then every moment they're growing in that soil, they're not being disturbed. So, yes, you want to make sure that they're strong, which maybe sounds obvious, but I can't tell you how many beans I've tried to like, and peas too. There's this old chicken fence and I just don't want to throw it away yet. Maybe I can just trellis something else on it one more season. Oh, use it for like bunny fencing or something. If it's at all weak, it will just fall over in the weight of full size peas and full size beans. So, also garden fencing. Don't forget that if you have a garden fence, you probably have a trellis. So, feel free to trellis things on them. And also, a living trellis, like corn, like amaranth, like sunflowers, if you give them a 2 to 3 week head start, and if you're planting something like a Three Sisters garden, I love you. Corn, beans, and squash, just give that corn a head start by at least 2 weeks, and then plant your squash at the same time that you plant your beans, because those squash will quickly overtake the corn as well. And quick check in, you want to, if you're growing a Three Sisters garden, only grow fall harvested crop. So, not green beans, think dry beans, not sweet corn, think flour corn, flint corn, popcorn, not summer squash, think winter squash. The idea is for it to all become this wild jungle doing its thing that you come in the fall. And I'm looking right now, I took down our blog, our Fruition Seeds blog about Three Sisters gardening, because it's not up to me to appropriate this information. And I'm sharing this little thoughts with you and hoping that you might actually know someone who is Indigenous for whom this is their life way and their family members who is joyfully sharing this information. In which case, share it with me. I would love to share it with the world and be lifting up their lineage and their beautiful joy and traditions that they are openly sharing. And when I find such things, I will share it out. But in the meantime, I want thank you for bearing with me as I share some culturally appropriated knowledge and attempt to be humble in my unlearning and our larger learning together. So now let's talk about inoculation. So inoculating beans and peas too. All legumes have these remarkable relationships with rhizobia, with these tiny little bacteria that do something amazing. So let me back up. You don't have to inoculate your beans. This is just an optional invitation. And so, yes, your beans have been, all beans and peas and legumes have been in relationship with these rhizobial bacteria for hundreds of millions of years. It's an incredibly ancient symbiosis where where this photosynthesizing bean, that green, is photosynthesizing sugars from sunlight. Absolute alchemy. Plants are amazing. So the bacteria can't create their own sugars. They're like, thanks, plant. Can I have some of your sugars? And they, in exchange, have this amazing capacity of turning atmospheric nitrogen into bioavailable nitrogen. Utterly unbelievable. So the plant, the bean, the pea, the red bud, all the legumes are like, here, have some of our extra sugars, some of our extra carbon from our photosynthetic phenomena. And oh, you've got this wonderful nitrogen that you fixed out of the air. We love nitrogen. So it's this beautiful symbiosis and such a profound symbiosis to the extent that you'll see, if you dig up your bean plants at the end of the season, on the roots you'll see these little nodules that look like these little knobby things just kind of coming off the roots. They're very distinct from the rest of the fibrous root system. And it's such a profound symbiosis that they're not just growing adjacent to those roots. The cellular DNA of that bacteria is literally intracellular, like inside the cell wall of the plant, of that root tissue of the legume. So they are doing this work like as intimately as living beings can. It's unbelievable. So if you see those little nodules, go ahead and slice them open. They're quite small, so you'll need a very small knife that's very sharp. Slice them open. If it's white inside, you've got plenty of nitrogen in your soil, and those nitrogen fixing bacteria are kind of just going on for the ride. They didn't need to work too hard. But if they're pink inside, they were working very hard and creating tons of bioavailable nitrogen from atmospheric nitrogen. So, inoculation, you don't have to inoculate your beans or your peas. These rhizobial bacteria are ubiquitous across planet Earth. And so they very likely are endemic to your garden. But if you aren't sure, you can always purchase inoculant and it's like this brown powder and simply toss that. They'll have instructions of how much to put in what kind of bag for what kind of quantity, but basically you just coat these seeds right before you plant them with the inoculum, and then you can be really confident that those nitrogen fixing bacteria are right there for your beans and they will be in symbiosis. And those bacteria aren't going anywhere for the season or for the entire rest of your gardening life, and likely the life of your great, 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 great grandchildren and their gardens, should we all be so fortunate. So yes, you really only need to inoculate once. It's not an annual thing by any means, but just a little note on inoculation. And now I'd love to talk about companion planting with beans. So I love companion planting, and check out our companion Fruition's Guide to Companion Planting, our blog, if you haven't already. And so for beans, my favorite is basically an interplanting strategy where if they imagine my hands are rows of beans, you have 18 inches between those beans. That's kind of a lot of space. That's plenty of space for a single row or maybe a 2-inch band of a quick growing leaf. Maybe it's cilantro. Maybe it's basil. Maybe it's dill. Maybe it's lettuce. Maybe it's arugula. Maybe it's mesclun mix. Pick your not so poison. Pick any quick growing green. And these are all cut and come again greens. But keep in mind in this particular interplanting that you're only going to get one harvest from it. After the point that you're harvesting it, the foliage of the beans grow really quickly. And so by the time it's 3 weeks later and you're harvesting that lettuce in between your bean rows, the foliage of those beans are overlapping. And so they won't have enough light to continue growing. But you'll get one harvest, but instead of three. But the great news is you get another harvest. One is more than zero. So yes, that is my favorite way to companion plant. And especially if it's something like cilantro, especially something like dill, all of those aromatics from that dill, that Umbelliferae family, just attract so many beneficial insects like lacewings and ladybugs. So now let's talk about succession sowing. With beans, you've got the option of pole beans and bush beans. With pole beans, you don't need to succession sow them. And again, they are going to both have approximately in the same bit of soil with the same access to the same nutrients. Bush beans and pole beans are equally abundant. You will harvest about the same amount of beans from each kind of plant. The difference is this: that pole bean is going to be just gradually offering that harvest as the season goes on. That bush bean is going to concentrate that harvest in just a few week period. So there's no reason to succession sow pole beans. Just plant them once and you'll be enjoying them all through the season. Bush beans, since they're concentrated harvest in just a few weeks, if you want a consistent harvest throughout the season, go ahead and plant multiple successions. So we're planting beans right now about Memorial Day, around last frost, wherever your zone might be. And we're planting every 3 weeks until about 3 months before before fall frost. So for us here in zone 5, that looks like our first succession around Memorial Day. Our second succession is generally around mid-June, and our final succession is around mid-July. So that's about 3 months before final frost, or frost in fall. And so, yes, a few thoughts on succession sowing beans. And there's plenty of space after you've harvested any of those for lots of other crops to come after that. So feel free to succession sow with so many other crops besides, oh, pardon me, besides beans. And now let's talk about feeding. So, just really quickly, we love to feed everything in our garden with fish emulsion. And did I bring some? Of course I did. It's show and tell always. So, fish emulsion is amazing. But also, if you have compost, you can make compost tea. If you have worm castings, you can make worm castings tea. Anything that's really nutrient dense, you can make tea of, and you can either foliar feed spraying on the leaves. Leaves literally uptake nutrients just like roots. Have I mentioned plants are amazing? But also you can root drench as well. So that you take that dilution of water and you want to just pour that right on the roots. And I will be so delighted if you are not. Also spraying it in the evening on your plants, increasing humidity in your plants, increasing your plant susceptibility for disease, since water is the primary vector for every disease on the planet. But rather, yeah, root drench and foliar feed in the morning when at all possible before 10 a.m. Is the dream. So now let's talk about containers and beans. So bush beans tend to do better in containers than pole beans. And there's a lot of reasons. Namely, they just don't have as much energy that they're trying to put into vegetative growth. And so they have more of that energy to go into your production, your delicious beans that you are growing. So, yes, bush beans are generally more abundant in containers. Minimum 10 gallons, ideally 15-gallon containers or larger. Remember, with container gardens, bigger is better, which is the only time that I ever use that phrase. And don't skimp on fertility, whether it's compost, whether it's any of our slow release or quick release granular fertilizers. Don't skimp on fertility. Pack it all into those containers, weave it into every square inch of that container so your plants will be inspired to grow into every nook and cranny of that container and surround you with that much more abundance. And if you're growing pole beans in containers, here's a few keys. Go big, seriously, 15 gallons minimum. You want to have 3 plants in that container, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but more than that, it's 1 step forward, 3 steps back. So 3 plants, and have them grow up something tall, maybe even a sunflower or a corn, but ideally something that is just a stake so that it's not going to be requiring that many more nutrients, which are just so finite in containers. And then because they're growing up, there's plenty of space in that container. I love to grow just this big wide band, almost this wide living donut of a quick growing cut and come again, either lettuce, mesclun mix, basil, cilantro, dill. If you also have low growing parsley or maybe a dwarf compact marigold, that's another nice thing. So that it's just this low, lovely donut as you have these pole beans rising up from the center. And other things to keep in mind with containers, we have this phenomenal, well, don't let me boast. We have a mini course that's totally free. Our 8 keys of container gardening mini course, totally free on our website. So if you're interested in container gardening, dive into that. There's so much more to share. And just keep in mind, especially with pole beans and containers, if the foliage is getting yellow, as if your abundance is waning, your plants are hungry. And so be sure that you're feeding every other week, ideally with fish emulsion, with compost tea, with worm castings tea. You want to be getting ahead of that curve in the same way that if we're dehydrated, we were already needing more water before that sensation of thirst came in. So if you're seeing plants yellow, if you're seeing production wane, those plants are already hungry. So as much as you can get ahead of that curve, prevention is the best cure. And speaking of prevention as best cure, let's talk about pests and diseases. There's quite a few in the bean department here in the Northeast. So there are three main pests that insects that just tend to do harm to our tender garden beans here in the Northeast. And those are the Mexican bean beetle, aphids, and leafhoppers. So let's break it down. Here's just a few keys to keep in mind. There's so much more in our bean growing guide. I can't wait to share it with you. And pictures are 1,000 words. So there's some lovely pictures in there. And so, yes, Mexican bean beetles, they're closely related to ladybugs, ladybird beetles. So they look just like ladybugs, except instead of red, orange, they're copper with black spots. About the same size, they can be a little bit larger. And both the larva and the adults just munch the leaves away. They skeletonize your leaves, leaving just the veins and then just a few little fibers in between. They're just eating that palisade layer and all of your leaf. So, and they're ravenous. And if their populations aren't like spotted, scouted, and squished, they really quickly skeletonize your leaves. So, yes, you want to be squishing them at every life stage. And you'll see the picture in our growing guide for beans. Their eggs are bright yellowish orange and laid in clusters of like 40 to 50 often. And then when they hatch, their larvae are yellow and kind of yellow orange with these wild spracked spines coming off them. They're kind of beautiful. They look honestly like something that you'd see on the Great Barrier Reef. They're incredible. So they're like these little yellow fat tacos with spines coming off the spines that aren't spiny at all. They're just squishy, but they look like they're just incredible creatures. And so squish those. And if you don't squish them, then you definitely are going to want to squish them when they turn into an adult, which will quickly procreate and the cycle will continue. So, yes, absolutely beautiful creatures in your garden that you will do well to look at that picture, go out and actively scout for them, and then actively squish them at every life stage you see, and know that you are not alone. Mexican bean beetles are also enjoyed by soldier beetles and assassin bugs and parasitoid braconid wasps and ladybugs. So you are not the only person, although you're not eating them for supper, you are not the only being in your garden who is killing your Mexican bean beetles. And thank goodness. So let's talk a little bit about aphids as well. Aphids love shade and humidity, and there just tends to be a lot of shade and humidity in the overlapping foliage, especially of bush beans. So they're not a big deal. They generally just will like suck the like sappy sugars out of plants. But in the case of beans, they transmit bean mosaic virus, which is totally annoying. Like it's totally just like mosquitoes, you wouldn't be so bad, but do we really have to deal with all the diseases that you transmit? So similarly with aphids. So with aphids, check out our blog, 3 Ways to Prevent and Manage Aphids Organically. There's a lot to be shared, but catching them early and often makes all the difference. And just managing your plants, whether they're beans or beyond, so that there's more airflow and less humidity will just set you up for success, i.e., will decrease the likelihood that aphids will love growing in your garden. So finally, leaf hoppers. They're tiny, an eighth of an inch long. They're lime green. They live on the undersides of leaves. They're really hard to find. But you often will see their hopper burn, as it's called. Leaf hoppers create hopper burn, which looks like foliage being crinkled and warped, kind of curling with small triangular brown spots at the leaf margins, at the edges of leaves. So again, take a look at our blog and just online. A picture is 1,000 words. And once you see anything on your beans that you're like, that looks unusual, not a green leaf, feel free to email us, Cooperative Extension, and we will be happy to help identify these things. But know that leafhoppers too are predated by lacewings and ladybugs, assassin beetles. They're just ravenous, beneficial insects that will eat lacewings, pardon me, eat leafhoppers any chance they get. So again, squishing and also insecticidal soap is a really excellent way to control your leafhopper situation. And now let's talk about diseases. Oh, actually, I'm not going to talk long about diseases because they are so profoundly visual. So take a look at our growing guide for more info, send us pictures, look at extensions, resources, but know that here in the Northeast, white mold, anthracnose, and bean mosaic virus are the three most common diseases that beans get. And I would love to just leave you in this disease department with these notions, which are the ways to prevent disease. Because in organic gardens, and even if you aren't organically gardening, you probably would prefer your plants to be healthy. So here are the ways to help your plants who have immune systems just like us. Here are the ways to bolster your plants' immune systems. First and foremost, nutrient rich soil. So every chance you can get, adding compost, other kinds of fertility, deciduous leaves that are chopped, as long as they're not black walnuts, anything that you can do to build your soil will build the immunity of all of the plants growing in your soil. And also just no overcrowding. Airflow is so important, and it also decreases humidity, which just increases your plant's tenacity in terms of being resistant to disease. So yes, give plants plenty of space. And you'll see on the backs of our packets, there's some info about what that plant spacing when they're full size looks like, because it's kind of hard to imagine what a tiny little seed, whether it's a lettuce or an acorn, how much space it might need as a full adult plant, full mature plant. So take a look at our packets or on our website for that info. And also water the soil, not the leaves. And so whether that's drip irrigation or root drenching, just be sure that when you're adding water to your plants, which is almost inevitable, that you're making sure that you keep water at the roots where they need it most rather than the leaves, which is just going to increase leaf humidity, which is just going to increase their susceptibility to disease. And finally, there's disease resistant varieties. Fruition shares a great deal of disease resistant bean varieties, but I always love, love, love to remind folks that disease resistance is that's the least, that's the most brittle strategy of all. If you have a disease resistant variety that's still in poor soil, planted too close that you're watering the leaves of, it's going to be susceptible to disease. So yes, that is always on the list, but it's always on the bottom of the list. So now let's talk very briefly about season extension. Beans are very cold sensitive. So at the barest hint of 34 degrees, they're going to crisp and turn brown and die. So do everything you can to plan so that you can harvest your beans before the frost comes. For bush beans, that means planting no later than 3 months before that fall frost approximately. You can, as a last gasp, toss a bed sheet over them, and they might save them for a day. If you have hoops and floating row cover, you might save them for a few weeks beyond. But yeah, it's better in general. Anything that you can do to harvest before frost, you will be enjoying them that much more. And finally, just a few thoughts on harvest and then our common mistakes. So, in harvesting, keep in mind that with bush beans, with pole beans, it's the same amount of abundance. It's just all laid out over a much longer time horizon in the case of a pole bean, and it's concentrated within a few weeks on a bell curve of production where they taper in, there's a ton, they taper out in a bush bean. So, other things to keep in mind with the snap stage versus shell and dry. Snap stage, taste the range. Taste them when they're tiny. See what they taste like then. When they're 2 inches long, 5 inches long, give them a taste when they're getting to be a foot long. Just get to know them at all these different stages because they have different levels of sweetness, different levels of nuttiness, and of course the tenderness, the stringlessness or not, or fibrousness. Just get to know that entire range. It's such a joy to be growing your own and being able to taste all of those nuances. Keep in mind that the purple beans are easiest to harvest because purple is not green. So your leaves are green. Green beans, turns out, are quite camouflaged when it comes to living in green plants. So that's why wax beans, your yellow beans, but especially your purple beans just stand out and are so much easier to harvest. And keep in mind also, so sadly, those purple delectable anthocyanins are water soluble, which means, among other things, that as you cook them, your purple beans are going to turn green. It's devastating, I know. But the good news is your yellow beans will remain yellow. So, other things to keep in mind as you're harvesting, as shell beans, you want to harvest those just before those green succulent pods are turning gold. And of course, your dry beans, you're harvesting just as they turn or as they're turning gold. In our short seasons that are incredibly humid here in the Northeast, it's really important to be harvesting those dry beans quickly. Even though in a arid climate, you could wait 2 weeks, 2 months, and they're just going to be sitting there waiting for you. It's like they're in the pantry already in an arid climate. But in a humid climate, those golden pods are going to start to decompose. Bacteria, fungi, they're going to start to rot. So it's really important that as soon as you are seeing those golden beans and you want, that's when you harvest them, whether it's for dry beans to eat or dry beans to then have a seed stock to grow again and to share with friends. So crucial to harvest them promptly. And edamame, keep in mind that you're harvesting them essentially in the snap bean stage, but their pods aren't delicious. It's just those beans inside. And again, taste them at all of those stages of flavor. There's so much nuance, and there's about a pretty brief window. It's about a 10-day, week-long 10-day window on a bell curve of their very harvest, their very concentrated harvest. We tend to harvest entire plants all at once, and then we get to, taste the rainbow. We have that lovely bell curve of some are more plump than others. But if you want to be harvesting individual beans, that's totally marvelous as well. And please do as brings you joy. So, yes, let's do common mistakes and then our closing song. So, common mistakes: sown too early. Beans sown too early, i.e., before your final frost, they have a very high likelihood of simply rotting instead of germinating. Also, crowding beans is such a reality, especially with bush beans. Their overlapping foliage just harbors so much humidity and so little airflow, which just sets you up for so many diseases. So, super common mistake is just not thinning enough and having them be overcrowded as a result. And then also missing stage deliciousness is really common. It's really easy to miss. It's almost inevitable you'll miss a few beans, which means just let them go to seed and enjoy them. If they are a pole bean, especially though, you might want to harvest them because here's the thing: once plants are maturing seed, they tend to resist putting more energy into their vegetative growth and continue fruiting. So if you want your pole beans to keep producing, keep harvesting your beans, even if you miss their tender, delicious snap stage. And that way you'll get to enjoy that much more abundance. Also, not noticing pests, not noticing disease until they're just rampant is such a common mistake people make. And also, not feeding enough preemptively or retroactively in containers, super common mistake that is so easy to not make. Don't make that mistake, friends. And finally, last two mistakes, right? They're just learning experiences. You're not wrong. They're not mistakes. Either not planting enough or planting too much. So many people wish they had planted more beans because they just want to put up way more dilly beans. And then so many people also are just inundated with beans and they're a lot of work to pick. So in either case, it pays to have friends and be growing gardens in community. So if you have more than you need, you know someone else who would love more. And if you would love more, then you likely know someone who has plenty that they don't have time enough to pick, and they would love to invite you over to pick them. So, friends, this has been delightful. And we love to end and begin with a song, story, poem, with something to ground us in our time together. And this morning, this evening, today, a song. I'm a little cookie, yes I am. I was made by the cookie man. And on my way from that cookie pan, a little piece broke off of me. A little piece broke off of me. A little piece broke off of me. But I can taste just as good as a regular cookie can. It goes on. There's a verse about Tootsie Rolls. There's a lot of delightful verses. And the moral of the story is this: the cookie's going to crumble. There are no mistakes, only learning experiences. And it's so much fun to enjoy cookies by yourself. Yes, but especially with friends and people you love. So, yes, enjoy gardening by yourself in those moments are so important. Also, enjoy growing gardens and growing yourselves with people you love. I am so honored to grow with you in all of these ways, friends. Thank you so much for all that you grow and all that you do. And if you wouldn't mind coming off mute and thanking Kira and Miriam and Matthew. And we'll see you
Thank
next time.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
sis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bless you.